This is how I design a character from scratch in Zbrush. So usually I don't have a clear image of what I'm going to do, but I keep massaging and bake the idea as it goes on. In this video, I'm going to briefly show my mindset to design and sculpt an orc bust. The workflow is applicable in any digital sculpting software such as Zbrush, Blender, or even Nomad Sculpt on tablets. Let's start from the first step, which is gathering your references. These are some of the pictures I collected from Pinterest. It's just to get inspired by the mood, also use some of the cool details I see to get ideas for my work. The final result won't be anything close to these images. After collecting the references, I start blocking out. As you see, starting with sphere, I like it because it gives my work a dynamic vibe. You can also use base meshes provided by Zbrush or download from options available on internet. Blockout is all about finding the bigger shapes of the design. In other words, seeing the character as some big blocks assembled over each other to resemble the overall feeling of it. What matters here is just finding the rough proportions of the character and blocking the main shapes. Then later we develop each part as we go on. So here I'm finding the bigger facial forms first. I even keep some parts as separate subtools like the ears. This makes it easier for me to tweak the shapes in blocking stage. I use a lot of extracting and appending subtools just to block out the idea I have in mind as fast as I can. And then later I polish each piece or measure them and do the proper modeling. For armors blocking, I try to keep my models low poly and as clean as possible. At this stage, I use a method to check if the design works as a whole package together, and that's by zooming out and seeing the character in a quiet, small size. This way you can judge the design without getting deep into details. Here I'm just doing a rough hair sculpt to have some sort of volume there for now. Later I will create a complete video talking about different ways of sculpting hair, but now I'm just making the base volume, extract shapes as clumps, and add hair strand details on them. Silhouette is the next factor I try to keep in mind. You can use the small window on the corner of the viewport to check your silhouette easily. By checking that, I realized I need more variation of bigger forms on the face. Also, the chin is looking too weak for this type of character. So I just go and modify my design by adding some curvy shapes on mouth and teeth area, also fixing the chin by adding more volume underneath it. After getting the main shapes in place, I turn off the mirror brush and try to break the symmetrical design by adding some variations on different parts of the head. It can also be used to add a bit of story to the character, like what happened to them before, scars, broken nose, a bit shifted to a side mouth, and things like that. Knowing the realistic anatomy in terms of proportions, forms, and what's going on underneath the skin can help a lot while designing a character from imagination. If we go a few steps back, you can see me here trying to define the forms of the head based on the concept I have in mind, but at the same time figuring out what's going on underneath the skin so I can make it feel realistic as much as possible. Now let's work a bit on teeth. I usually sculpt a rough teeth first, so later on I can detach some parts or extract or append subtools to have a cleaner asset. So here I'm detaching some teeth from gum to be able to sculpt them one by one easier, and then just playing with composition to figure out what matches the face better. Using the clay brush to add some details, breakups, and just make the teeth less smooth. And as it's just a concept sculpt, I'm not going to model the hidden parts for now. At this point, using Transpose Master is quite useful to apply overall shape corrections without doing so one by one on each subtool. Just be careful not to deform the parts that need to keep their shapes, like eyes for example. Here I still have the body as a separate subtool, so in order to merge them properly, what I do is first defining more forms to match the anatomy a bit, then merging subtools and apply Dynamesh to blend them into each other, doing some sculpting to remove the connection seam line. Next I apply Z-remesher for a cleaner mesh. At the end, reproject all details back from the old sculpt. Okay, going to the armors now, I like using Z-modeler tools and create a clean base mesh, then extrude and add loops to the hard edges. removing all polys except one side and do a few zero measure until it gives me a clean topology. Then using ZModeler, I remove as many edges that I can, adding loop space on the forms I'm looking for, moving loops, and then extrude and add edge loops. It's one of the workflows that I use for creating accessories for concept sculpt or even sometimes the final model. I enjoy a lot sculpting damages on hard surface assets, basically using clay buildup, edge polish, trim dynamic, and move brush. You can create damage, broken, sword marks, and cracks. Just be careful to not do it too much all over the asset and make it too noisy by all these details. Try to be creative and tell stories, like what happened that made these damages, how deep they should be on some areas and why, how is this piece of metal is created by ironsmith, and things like that. All these will help you make the details more believable. You can also drag some alpha maps over the surface to make some subtle breakups and details, and then use them as a guide to exaggerate some parts or reduce some of them with manual sculpting. Next, I'm trying to add some spiky metal pieces to the neck accessory to add more tribal or barbarian vibe to the design, simply by extracting and moving the meshes out, then applying Dynamesh to recreate all the stretched polygons. Sculpt some flat shapes to look more like smithed metals. Next, I just copy them around the neck and make some variations by changing the size. I will come back to them later for details. Starting the skin detailing, I usually do a morph target first, because it gives me the ability to remove any detail I'm not happy with. For bigger details like bumpy shapes on the head, it's easier to paint the mask first and then use inflate brush to bump them up. Since we have morph target, I can go back and reduce some bumps easily using the morph brush, and then I just add some noise over it to blend them better to the skin. Mostly for creature skins, I like to break up the smoothness by brushing a bit with clay buildup here and there and add some secondary forms. After adding these bumpy details, I use my standard brush with a sharp alpha and define more some of those bumps. Moreover, I use the same brush for all secondary wrinkle details. Let's talk about the skin pores. I use morph target again so that I can tweak the depth of the details anytime on any area. Layers are quite useful in detailing process as well. Here I'm using alphas from my library to make a basic layer of generic pores. For his neck also using another big alpha as base layer, and later I will add more details over them. After that, I use my skin pores brush and drag those tiny holes all over the skin, especially around the nose, cheeks, forehead and chin. Sometimes, after adding all these details, some of the sharper secondary forms get a bit washed out. That's why I get back and try to brush over my skin pore details and make some secondary details sharper. Using the dot stroke and alpha 60, I can create very small wrinkles and I add them all over my tiny details. This is a quick way to connect the tiny holes together just like the natural skin, and also it adds some direction to the pores. As I'm almost done with the design, I like to go and apply some solid colors to my subtools just to bring some life to the concept. And later on I will do the proper poly paint. You can also apply different Zbrush materials to each part just to help showcasing the variation of textures. As my last design change, I decided to add a ponytail to hair. So just remove the back part, extracted the mesh and deformed it as my base shape. Then just used the same method as before and added some clumps and sculpted some string details. In order to make the hair look like a bit messy, I'm adding some tiny clumps spiking out to mimic the flyaway hair. Finishing up the concept, I'm going back to the armor and drag my alpha map on the leftover parts and call it done after that. Just remember that this sculpt is at the concept phase only, meaning it's not a production ready sculpt as it needs a lot of cleanups and proper detailing. It took me about 7 hours to finish this. You can watch the whole 7 hours time lapse in normal speed, and download the zip file from the links in the description. Thanks a lot for watching. I really hope this video is useful for you, and let me know if you have any questions or need any specific topic to make a video about.